If you're enjoying this video, smash that like button, subscribe, and hit the bell. Share it with your friends, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Every like and subscribe helps the channel grow. My name is William Thornton, but most folks just call me Bill. I'm 42 years old, a park ranger at Mammoth Cave National Park in Kentucky. It's the world's longest cave system, stretching for hundreds of miles underground. To most people, it's a wonder of nature, beautiful, mysterious, and full of history. To me, it's something else entirely. It's my escape, my sanctuary, or at least it used to be. I came here after Vietnam. I was a combat medic back then, patching up soldiers in the middle of chaos. I saw things no one should ever see, things that still haunt me when I close my eyes at night. The caves were supposed to be my way out of all that. The darkness felt safe, like a shield between me and the world. The silence was comforting, like the war couldn't reach me down there. But lately, something feels wrong. It started in July 1976. During the bicentennial celebrations, the park was busier than ever. Families on vacation, college kids looking for adventure, and tourists from all over the country. It was hot that summer, unbearably so, and even the animals seemed to notice. Bats were flying deeper into the caves to escape the heat, and blind cave fish were acting strange, floating dead in pools where they should have been thriving. I've been working these caves for years, leading tours through passages most people don't even know exist. I know every twist and turn like the back of my hand. But this summer, something changed. The air felt heavier somehow, like it was pressing down on you. There were vibrations too, faint but constant, making the delicate formations tremble as if the cave itself was alive. Small rockfalls started happening more often. Nothing major at first, just pebbles rolling down walls or dust settling where it hadn't moved in centuries. But it wasn't normal. I could feel it in my gut. I live alone in a cabin near the cave entrance with my dog Sergeant, a three-legged German Shepherd who survived Vietnam with me. He's my only real companion these days since my divorce and the distance with my teenage son. At night, I'd sit on my porch with a glass of bourbon and write down everything I noticed about the caves. Changes in temperature, strange sounds, anything unusual, and unusual things were piling up fast. It all started with a group of college kids. They were experienced spelunkers, or so they claimed, and had gotten special permission to explore one of the lesser-known passages. I wasn't too worried at first. These things happen all the time. People come here looking for adventure, and as long as they follow the rules, they're usually fine. But when they didn't check back in by nightfall, I knew something was wrong. The next morning, we sent out a search team. We found their gear scattered in a narrow tunnel, a couple of helmets, ropes, flashlights, but no sign of the kids themselves. The weird thing was that the helmets were still intact, just lying there on the ground, like they'd been dropped. No blood, no signs of a struggle, nothing. It was like they'd just vanished into thin air. That's when I noticed something strange on the walls of the tunnel. Claw marks, deep grooves scratched into the limestone, but that didn't make sense. Limestone is tough. Nothing down here should have been able to leave marks like that. I ran my fingers over them, and they were sharp, precise, almost deliberate. It sent a chill down my spine. After that, things started escalating. The cave's natural sounds, the dripping water, the occasional crack of settling rocks, began to change. They became rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat echoing through the tunnels. At first, I thought it was just my imagination or maybe some kind of geological shift. But then Sergeant started acting strange too. He's a tough dog. Not much scares him after what we've been through together. But one night, he refused to go near the cave entrance. He just stood there growling, his ears pinned back and his tail between his legs. I'd never seen him like that before. It was as if he could sense something I couldn't. And then there were the voices. One evening, during a routine equipment check, my radio picked up something odd. At first, it was just static, nothing unusual for being underground. But then I heard it whispers, faint and distant, like someone was talking just out of reach. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but it didn't sound like English or any language I'd ever heard before. I asked around to see if anyone else had heard it, but no one had. They all looked at me like I was crazy, just a stressed-out ranger spending too much time in the dark. Maybe they were right, or maybe they didn't want to believe me. The final straw came when I stumbled across an old journal in one of the storage rooms near the visitor center. It was dated 1876, exactly 100 years ago, and belonged to a man named Samuel Hargrove, who had worked as a guide back then. Most of it was normal stuff, descriptions of tours, notes about cave formations, until the last few pages. The handwriting got messier and more frantic as it went on. Hargrove wrote about strange sounds and claw marks just like the ones I'd seen. He mentioned animals behaving strangely and people disappearing without a trace. His last entry was barely legible. It wakes every century, we disturbed it. God help us all. I closed the journal and sat there for a long time staring at nothing in particular. My hands were shaking, but I wasn't sure if it was from fear or anger or maybe both. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't new. It had been here, long before me, long before any of us. And now, it was awake again. I didn't want to believe it at first. Everything I'd seen and heard, the claw marks, the whispers, the strange behavior of the animals, felt like pieces of a puzzle I didn't want to put together. But the journal from 1876 stuck with me. The way Samuel Hargrove described something waking every century, it wasn't just a story. It felt real, too real. I started digging through old records, anything I could find about the history of Mammoth Cave. Most of it was harmless, tales of Native American burials, ghost stories, even some nonsense about shadowy creatures that could steal your soul. But buried in all that folklore were patterns. Disappearances, strange sounds, sudden cave-ins, all happening roughly 100 years apart. It was like clockwork. And then there were the animals. The deeper I went into the cave, the stranger things got. Blind cave fish floated lifeless in pools, their bodies twisted in ways that didn't make sense. Bats, what few were left, had abandoned their roosts entirely. Even Sargent wouldn't follow me past a certain point anymore. He'd just whimper and back away, his ears flat against his head. That's when I saw it for the first time. I was inspecting one of the deeper passages, an area we rarely took visitors to. The air was colder than usual, and my flashlight beam seemed weaker somehow, swallowed up by the darkness ahead. Then I heard it, a faint clicking sound, like claws tapping against stone. It wasn't loud, but it was steady, rhythmic, almost like it was coming closer. I froze, holding my breath as my flashlight swept across the tunnel walls. At first, there was nothing, just rock and shadow. But then, movement. Something pale and massive shifted just beyond the edge of my light. It was quick, too quick, and disappeared into a narrow crevice before I could get a good look. But I knew what I saw wasn't natural. Over the next few days, I pieced together what little I could about this thing. It wasn't just an animal. It was something ancient. Something that had adapted perfectly to life in the deepest parts of the cave. Its body was pale and segmented, like an insect, but far larger than anything that should exist underground. It had dozens of long limbs ending in claws sharp enough to carve through limestone. What scared me most wasn't its size or its speed. It was its intelligence. This thing wasn't just surviving down here. It was hunting. And it didn't rely on sight like we do. It used sound, echolocation to navigate and track its prey. Worse still, it could mimic voices perfectly. Human voices. I remembered what Hargrove had written in his journal. It speaks to you, lures you in. That's how it hunted, by imitating people's voices, calling for help or whispering just out of reach until you got close enough for it to strike. And then there were its other abilities, the ones that didn't make any sense at all. Being near it felt wrong in ways I couldn't explain. My head would pound, my chest would tighten, and I'd feel this overwhelming sense of dread, like I was being watched from every angle at once. Sometimes I'd see things that weren't there, hallucinations of endless drops or walls closing in around me. It wasn't until later that I realized what those feelings were: fear. Not mine, but its fear projected onto me like a weapon. The more I learned about this thing, the clearer it became. This wasn't just an animal waking up after a long sleep. It was something far worse, something that had been feeding on us for centuries without anyone realizing it. And now, it was awake again. After the second tour group vanished, the park superintendent had no choice but to act. He called in a team of rangers, armed and ready to go deeper into the caves than anyone ever had before, and of course they asked me to lead them. I knew the caves better than anyone else, but I wasn't sure if that was a blessing or a curse. There were 6 of us in total. Me, 3 other rangers, and 2 volunteers from the local search and rescue team. We packed everything we could think of: flashlights, climbing gear, radios, weapons. But deep down, I wasn't sure any of it would matter. I didn't tell them everything I knew. How could I? If I told them we were hunting something ancient and intelligent that could mimic human voices, they'd think I was crazy. Maybe I was. The first few hours were uneventful. We moved slowly, marking our path as we went. The deeper we got, the colder it became. The air felt thick, like it was pressing against my chest. Our flashlights seemed weaker too, their beams swallowed up by the darkness ahead. No one said much. The silence was heavy, broken only by the sound of our boots crunching against the stone floor. Then the equipment started failing. First, it was the radios. One by one, they cut out, replaced by static and faint whispers that made my skin crawl. Then our electric lights began flickering. We switched to backup lanterns and headlamps, but even those felt dimmer than they should have been. It was like the darkness itself was alive, swallowing up every bit of light we brought with us. And then, we heard it. At first it sounded like someone crying out for help, a man's voice echoing through the tunnels ahead. "Help me, please." The others froze, looking at me for direction. My stomach dropped. I knew that voice, it belonged to one of the missing spelunkers, but something about it wasn't right. It was too clear, too perfect, like a recording being played back on a loop. "We need to check it out," one of the rangers said. Already moving toward the sound. "Wait," I said quickly, grabbing his arm. "That's not him." He frowned at me. "How do you know?" "Just trust me," I said quietly. "It's not him." The voice came again, this time closer. "Help me, please." It sounded desperate, panicked, but there was no echo this time. No footsteps or shuffling to go with it. Just the voice floating in the air like it didn't belong there. That's when I saw movement in the shadows ahead, something pale and massive slipping silently between 2 rock formations. My heart pounded as I motioned for everyone to turn off their lights and stay quiet. We stood there in total darkness for what felt like an eternity, listening to the sound of claws clicking against stone as it moved closer and closer. Someone behind me whispered a prayer under their breath, and then silence. For a moment, I thought maybe it had left, until one of the volunteers screamed. I spun around just in time to see him being dragged into the darkness by something too fast to follow. His flashlight clattered to the ground and rolled toward us, its beam flickering wildly before going out completely. Panic set in after that. One of the rangers fired his shotgun blindly into the dark while another fumbled with his radio, shouting for backup that would never come. I grabbed Sergeant's leash and pulled him close as we backed into a narrow passageway where nothing big could follow us. But it didn't need to follow us. Not yet. The thing was playing with us now, picking us off one by one like a predator toying with its prey. It mimicked our voices perfectly, calling out names, begging for help, and every time someone broke formation or ran toward the sound, they were gone in seconds. By the time we reached what felt like an open chamber deep below the surface, there were only 3 of us left, me and 2 rangers who looked just as terrified as I felt. That's when we found its nest. The chamber was massive, far larger than any space I'd ever seen in the caves before. Our lights barely reached the walls, and the ceiling disappeared into darkness. The air was freezing, colder than anything I'd felt underground. It smelled awful, like rotting meat and damp earth. My stomach churned, but I forced myself to keep moving. Then my light caught something on the ground, and I stopped dead in my tracks. Bones, hundreds of them, scattered across the floor. Some were old, brittle with age, but others looked fresh. Human skulls, ribs, femurs, all piled up like some kind of grotesque offering. My hands shook as I realized what we were standing in. This wasn't just a cave, it was a feeding ground. The walls were covered in strange markings, pictographs carved into the stone by hands long gone. They showed people kneeling before something huge and shapeless, offering sacrifices to it. One image showed figures being dragged into the darkness by long, clawed limbs. Another showed what looked like a cave collapsing on top of the creature, trapping it beneath the earth. It's been here for centuries, I whispered to myself. Maybe longer. One of the rangers stepped forward, his flashlight shaking as he scanned the room. "What is this place?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Before I could answer, we heard it again, the clicking sound of claws against stone. It echoed through the chamber, coming from every direction at once. My heart pounded as I realized we weren't alone. "Stay close," I said quietly, gripping my flashlight like it was a weapon. The clicking grew louder, faster, until it stopped suddenly. The silence was deafening. Then came the voice, a perfect imitation of the ranger who had been taken earlier. "Bill, help me, please." It sounded so real, so desperate that for a split second I almost believed it, but then it stepped into the light. The creature was massive, its pale segmented body glistening in the dim glow of our flashlights. Dozens of long limbs ended in razor-sharp claws that clicked softly against the stone floor as it moved closer. Its head, or what I thought was its head, had no eyes, just smooth pale flesh and a gaping mouth lined with jagged teeth. It didn't charge us right away. It just stood there, swaying slightly as if studying us. Then I felt it, that overwhelming sense of dread washing over me like a wave. My chest tightened, my vision blurred, and for a moment I thought I was going to pass out. "Run!" I shouted, shoving one of the rangers toward an opening on the far side of the chamber. We sprinted through the tunnels as fast as we could, but it was right behind us. Its claws scraped against the walls as it squeezed through spaces that should have been too narrow for something its size. The sound was deafening, a horrible screeching noise that made my ears ring. I led us into a narrow passageway I knew well, one that looped back toward an unstable section of the cave system. If we could lure it there, we might have a chance to trap it. "This way," I yelled over my shoulder, but when I turned around, only one ranger was still with me. The other had vanished into the darkness without a sound. We reached the unstable section, a tunnel lined with loose rocks and cracks running up the walls and ceiling, and stopped to catch our breath. The remaining ranger looked at me with wide eyes filled with fear. "What now?" he asked shakily. I didn't answer right away because deep down I already knew what had to be done. "We bring it here," I said finally, "and we bring this whole section down on top of it. He'd. We'll never make it out in time." "I know," I said quietly. Before he could argue, we heard it again, the clicking claws echoing through the tunnel behind us. It was close now, too close to run anymore. "Go," I told him firmly. "Get out while you still can." He hesitated for a moment before nodding and taking off down another passageway. That left just me and Sargent standing there in the dark. I pulled out what little explosives we'd brought with us, small charges meant for clearing debris during rescues, and set them along the weakest points of the tunnel walls. My hands shook as I worked quickly, knowing every second counted. The clicking grew louder until finally, there it was. It crawled into view slowly this time, its elongated limbs bending unnaturally as it moved closer. Its mouth opened wide in what almost looked like a smile, as if it knew exactly what I was planning. "Come on," I muttered under my breath as I backed away toward the detonator switch. When it was close enough, so close that I could feel its cold breath on my skin, I hit the switch. The explosion rocked the tunnel with a deafening roar as rocks and debris came crashing down around us. For a moment, all I could hear was the sound of stone grinding against stone and Sargent barking frantically at my side. Then everything went black. When I opened my eyes, everything hurt. My head was pounding, my chest felt heavy, and there was dust in my mouth and nose. For a moment, I wasn't sure where I was or if I was even alive. Then I heard it, Sargent's faint whimpering beside me. He was alive too. I tried to move, but the weight of the rocks pinning me down made it almost impossible. My flashlight was gone, and the only light came from a small crack above me where daylight barely seeped through. The explosion had worked, at least I thought it had. The tunnel had collapsed completely, sealing off whatever was behind me. But as I lay there in the dark, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. My mind felt invaded, like something else was there with me. And then it hit me, a flash of images that weren't mine. Endless tunnels stretching beneath the earth, stretching far beyond Mammoth Cave. Other chamber like the one I'd found. Other things like the creature I'd faced. It wasn't alone. I don't know how long I lay there before the rescue team found me. Hours, days, time didn't feel real anymore. When they pulled me out, they said I was lucky to be alive. They didn't ask too many questions about what had happened down there, and I didn't volunteer much information either. What could I say? That something ancient and hungry had been feeding on people for centuries. That there might be more of them waiting in other caves around the country. They wouldn't believe me, even if I told them. The official report said the collapse was caused by unstable rock formations and that the missing people were never found. The park stayed open, though they closed off the deeper sections of the cave for safety reasons. But every time I see a news story about a hiker vanishing in some remote area or strange sounds being reported in another cave system, I wonder if it's happening again. A few months later, Dave found one of the missing spelunkers wandering in the woods near the park entrance. His clothes were torn, his hair had turned completely white, and he couldn't speak except to whisper 2 words over and over, breathing darkness. I've tried to move on since then, to put it all behind me, but some nights when everything is quiet, I can still hear it, the clicking of claws against stone echoing faintly in the back of my mind, and every time I do, I wonder how long until it wakes again. My name is David Nakano, and I've been a park ranger and search and rescue specialist for over 15 years. I've seen my fair share of strange things in the wilderness, things that most people wouldn't believe. But nothing, and I mean nothing, could have prepared me for what I experienced on Mount Rainier last winter. Mount Rainier is a place of breathtaking beauty, but it's also a place that demands respect. The snow-covered peaks, the endless forests, and the deep valleys. It's easy to get lost out there, both physically and mentally. People think they're invincible until the mountain shows them otherwise. And sometimes people don't come back at all. It had been a rough year for me. My wife, Emily, passed away in a car accident just 6 months earlier. She was my anchor, my reason to keep going. After she was gone, I threw myself into my work to escape the pain. But no matter how busy I kept myself, I couldn't escape her memory. Sometimes, when I was out on the mountain alone, I swore I could hear her voice in the wind, calling my name. It was probably just my mind playing tricks on me, or at least that's what I told myself. The winter season had been particularly harsh that year. Heavy snowstorms rolled in one after another, making it difficult for hikers and climbers to navigate the trails. Reports started coming in about strange things happening on the mountain. Hikers hearing voices when no one was around, seeing lights in places no human could possibly reach, and even losing hours of time without explanation. At first, I chalked it up to exhaustion or altitude sickness. But as the reports piled up, I couldn't ignore them anymore. One night, as I sat in the ranger station sipping a cup of lukewarm coffee, a call came through on the radio. A climbing team of 3 had gone missing near the summit. Their last transmission was garbled with static, but there was something else, something that sent chills down my spine. It sounded like rhythmic tapping in the background, almost like Morse code. But it wasn't Morse code. It didn't make any sense. I grabbed my gear and headed out into the stormy night. The wind howled like a living thing as I trudged through knee-deep snow toward the base camp where the climbers had last been seen. The mountain felt different that night, heavier somehow, like it was alive and watching me. When I reached the base camp, it was eerily quiet. The tents were still there, half buried in snow, but there was no sign of the climbers. Their gear was scattered around as if they'd left in a hurry. And then I saw it, something that made my stomach twist into knots. In the snow around the camp were strange patterns, perfectly concentric circles etched into the ground, as if someone had used a giant compass to draw them. They weren't made by footsteps or any tool I recognized. They were just there. I stood there staring at those circles for what felt like an eternity before snapping out of it. Something wasn't right on this mountain, and I was determined to find out what it was. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched as I stood there in the snow, staring at those strange circles. The wind was biting cold, and the trees around the camp swayed and creaked like they were whispering to each other. I forced myself to focus. The climbers were still out there somewhere, and they needed help. I started searching the area, calling out their names. "Hello? Is anyone out here?" But my voice just echoed back at me, swallowed by the mountain. Their tracks led away from the camp, heading toward a ridge that was dangerous even in good weather. In a storm like this, it was practically a death sentence. Why would they leave their camp and head up there? It didn't make sense. As I followed their trail, I noticed something strange. The footprints weren't consistent. They'd start off normal, like they were walking in a straight line, but then they'd scatter, like they were running or stumbling, and then they just stopped. No sign of them turning back, no sign of them falling or climbing anywhere else. Just gone. I stood there for a moment, my breath fogging up in the freezing air. The snow was falling harder now, and visibility was getting worse by the second. I knew I couldn't stay out here much longer without risking my own life, but something about this whole situation felt wrong, like there was more to it than just a group of climbers getting lost. As I turned to head back to the base camp and call for backup, I heard something. At first, I thought it was just the wind playing tricks on me again, but then it came again, a faint tapping sound. It wasn't random, it had a rhythm to it. Tap, 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 pause, tap, 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 tap. I froze in place, straining to hear over the wind. The tapping wasn't coming from any direction I could pinpoint. It seemed to echo all around me. My heart started pounding in my chest as I scanned the area with my flashlight, but all I could see was snow and shadows. "Hello?" I called out again, my voice shaking slightly now. "Is someone there?" No answer. The tapping stopped as suddenly as it had started, leaving an eerie silence behind. My instincts screamed at me to get off that ridge and back to safety, but something inside me wouldn't let me leave just yet. I had to know what was going on. I decided to head back down toward the base camp and radio for help. As I walked through the snowstorm, my mind raced with questions. What had happened to those climbers? Where did their tracks go? And what was that tapping sound? When I finally made it back to the base camp, everything looked exactly as I'd left it, except for one thing. My radio equipment, which had been working fine earlier, was now completely dead. No static, no signal, just silence. Frustrated and uneasy, I sat down in one of the abandoned tents to try and warm up while I figured out what to do next. That's when I noticed something else. A notebook lying half buried in the snow near one of the tents. Before I could decide what to do next, another sound reached me, this time not tapping but a voice. A woman's voice. "David." It called softly, almost drowned out by the wind. I froze in place. It couldn't be her. But it sounded exactly like Emily's voice. "David," she called again, this time more urgent. Tears stung my eyes as I turned toward where the voice seemed to be coming from. The cave below me. My heart told me to run toward her voice without thinking twice, but my gut screamed at me not to go anywhere near that cave. I didn't know what was waiting for me down there, or if Emily's voice was even real. But something deep inside told me that whatever this was, it wasn't human anymore. I stood there, frozen, staring down at the glowing cave below. My mind was spinning. That voice, it couldn't be Emily. She was gone. I knew that. But it sounded so real, so much like her, that it made my chest ache. The wind whipped around me, stinging my face with snow, but I couldn't move. Part of me wanted to run back to safety, but another part, a stronger part, needed to know what was down there. "David." The voice called again, softer this time, almost pleading. I swallowed hard and forced myself to take a step forward, then another. Before I knew it, I was climbing down toward the cave entrance. My boots slipped on the icy rocks, and my flashlight flickered again, but I kept going. The glow from the cave grew brighter as I got closer, lighting up the jagged walls with an eerie blue hue. When I finally reached the entrance, I hesitated. The air coming from inside was unnaturally cold, even for a mountain in winter, It felt heavy, like it was pressing down on me, making it harder to breathe. But the voice, her voice, was coming from inside. "Emily?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response. I stepped into the cave, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The walls were covered in ice that sparkled like glass, reflecting the blue light in strange patterns. It felt like stepping into another world, one that didn't belong on this mountain or anywhere else I'd ever been. As I moved deeper into the cave, the tapping sound started again. Tap, 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 pause, tap, tap, tap. It echoed off the walls surrounding me from all sides. My hands were shaking now, but I tightened my grip on the flashlight and kept going. Then I saw them. At first, I thought they were people, 3 figures standing perfectly still in the center of the cave. But as I got closer, I realized they weren't people at all. They were asterisk. Things asterisk. Their bodies looked like they were made of ice and stone, their faces frozen in expressions of fear and pain. And their eyes, if you could call them that, glowed faintly with that same blue light. I stopped in my tracks, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest. These weren't just random shapes in the ice. These were the climbers, the ones who had gone missing. David. Emily's voice came again, louder now. I spun around and pointed my flashlight toward where her voice had come from. That's when I saw her, or something that looked like her, standing at the far end of the cave. "Emily?" I whispered. She smiled at me, a soft, sad smile that made my heart ache, and took a step closer. But as she moved into the light from my flashlight, I realized something was wrong. Her face wasn't quite right. It was blurred around the edges, like a reflection in rippling water. And her body seemed to flicker and shimmer like the figures outside the cave. "David," she said again, reaching out a hand toward me. "Come with me." I took a step back instinctively. "You're not real," I said, my voice shaking. "You can't be real." Her smile faded, replaced by an expression of sorrow, or maybe frustration. "Don't you miss me?" she asked softly. "Don't you want to be with me again?" Tears filled my eyes as memories of her flooded back, her laugh, her touch, the way she used to hum while cooking dinner. Of course I missed her. Of course I wanted to be with her again. But deep down I knew this wasn't her. Not really. "What are you?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady even though fear was clawing at my throat. She tilted her head slightly, as if confused by my question. Then she stepped closer again, and this time I noticed something behind her. A massive shape looming in the shadows at the back of the cave. It wasn't human, or anything close to it. It looked like a shifting mass of ice and rock, its surface glowing faintly with that same blue light. It pulsed and moved as if it were alive, as if it were breathing, and tendrils of light stretched out from it toward Emily and the frozen climbers. That's when it hit me. This thing, whatever it was, wasn't just part of the mountain. It was the mountain, or at least some kind of consciousness tied to it. And somehow it had taken Emily's voice, her image, and used them to lure me here. "Let them go," I said firmly, gesturing toward the frozen climbers. The thing didn't respond, not directly, but Emily's form flickered slightly before speaking again. "They're part of us now, part of me. You can be too." "No," I said through clenched teeth. "I'm not staying here." The cave rumbled in response, a deep vibration that shook the ground beneath my feet, and suddenly everything went dark as my flashlight finally gave out. The darkness swallowed me whole. I couldn't see anything, not the walls of the cave, not the glowing figures, not even my own hands. All I could hear was the low rumble of the mountain, and my own shaky breathing. My heart felt like it was going to explode out of my chest. "David." Emily's voice came again, but now it sounded different, distorted, like it was coming from underwater. "Stay with me." "No." I shouted into the blackness. "You're not her. You're not real." The cave trembled in response, and I felt the ground shift beneath my feet. I stumbled, falling to my knees on the icy floor. My hands were freezing, but I didn't dare stop moving. I fumbled for my backup flashlight in my pack, praying it would still work. As I clicked it on, A weak beam of light cut through the darkness. The cave around me seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally, like it was alive and shifting with every breath I took. The glowing figures of the climbers were still there, motionless and eerie, but Emily, or whatever was pretending to be her, was gone. Instead, the massive shape at the back of the cave began to move. The pulsing blue light grew brighter, and tendrils of ice stretched out toward me like fingers reaching for prey. The air grew even colder, biting into my skin like needles. I scrambled backward, my mind racing for a plan. This thing, this entity, it wasn't just part of the mountain, it was feeding off people somehow, trapping them here and turning them into those frozen figures. It had taken their voices, their memories, and now it wanted me. But why? Why me? Then it hit me. It wasn't just trying to take me. It was trying to lure me. It had used Emily's voice because it knew she was my weakness. It wasn't just some mindless force. It was intelligent. It had been watching me all along. Why are you doing this? I shouted at the glowing mass, trying to keep my voice steady even though fear gripped every part of me. For a moment, everything went still. The tendrils stopped moving, and the rumbling quieted. Then a voice echoed through the cave. Not Emily's this time, but something deeper and colder. "We remember," it said slowly, each word echoing like a distant avalanche. "We, collect, collect. What?" I demanded, even though part of me didn't want to know the answer. "Memories," it replied. "Voices, lives, moments." It didn't make sense at first. Why would something like this care about memories? But as I looked at the frozen climbers again, it started to click. This thing wasn't killing people out of malice. It was absorbing them somehow, keeping pieces of them alive inside itself. "Let them go," I said firmly, standing up despite my shaking legs. "They don't belong to you." The rumbling returned, louder this time, shaking the entire cave. The tendrils of ice lashed out toward me again, forcing me to duck and scramble away. "You will join," the voice boomed. "No," I shouted back. "I won't." Desperation took over as I scanned the cave for anything I could use, anything that might stop this thing or at least slow it down. That's when I remembered something: electromagnetic interference. My radio had died earlier because of some kind of strange energy coming from this mountain. Maybe that same energy could be disrupted. I reached into my pack and pulled out an emergency flare gun, a last resort tool we carried for signaling helicopters during rescues. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. I aimed at the glowing mass in the back of the cave and fired. The flare shot through the air like a comet, its bright red light cutting through the eerie blue glow. When it hit the entity's core, there was an ear-splitting screech, a sound so loud and piercing that I had to cover my ears as I fell to the ground. The blue light flickered wildly before dimming slightly. The tendrils recoiled as if in pain, and for a brief moment everything went still again. I didn't waste any time. I grabbed one of the climbers' frozen bodies and pulled with all my strength. To my surprise and relief, the ice around them began to crack and break apart as if whatever held them there was losing its grip. One by one I freed all 3 climbers and dragged them toward the cave entrance as fast as I could. They were unconscious but alive, their bodies cold but not frozen solid like they'd appeared before. As we reached the mouth of the cave, that deep voice echoed one last time: "You cannot escape. We will always watch." I didn't look back. By some miracle, we made it back down the mountain alive. The climbers eventually woke up in the ranger station, confused and shaken but otherwise unharmed. They couldn't remember much about what had happened, just flashes of blue light and a feeling of being trapped in a dream. As for me, well, I haven't been back to Mount Rainier since that night. Part of me wants to believe it's over, that whatever that thing was is gone now, but deep down, I know better. Sometimes when I'm alone at night, I still hear her voice, Emily's voice, calling my name in the wind, and sometimes I hear that tapping sound too. My name is Robert Jefferson, but everyone calls me Bobby. I'm 28 years old, a Vietnam veteran, and the first black park ranger in this district of West Virginia. It's the summer of 1967, and I've been stationed out here in the Monongahela National Forest for a few months now. To most people, this place is just a quiet stretch of Appalachian wilderness, a sea of trees that stretches for miles. But to me, it's something else entirely. It feels alive in a way that's hard to explain, and not in a comforting way. The locals have a nickname for it, the Hanging Woods. They say it's because of the moss that hangs from the branches, like old ropes swaying in the breeze. But when you're walking alone under that thick canopy, where the sunlight barely makes it through, you can't help but feel like there's more to it than just moss. The air is heavy with moisture, and the constant mist clings to your skin like a second layer. Everything smells damp, like wet earth and rotting leaves. I came here hoping to leave things behind. The war, the memories, the tension that seems to be boiling over everywhere back in the cities. Out here, I thought I'd find peace, maybe even purpose. I live alone in a fire watchtower deep in the forest, surrounded by nothing but trees and silence. My job is simple: patrol the trails, keep an eye out for fires or lost hikers, and document the plant life for my research. I've always loved studying plants, maybe because they don't judge or talk back, but lately something feels off about this forest. The animals don't act right. Deer stand frozen for hours like statues, all staring in the same direction as if they're waiting for something. Birds have abandoned their nests completely, leaving eggs to rot in the damp air. And sometimes, just sometimes, the whole forest goes silent all at once. No bird song, no rustling leaves, no buzzing insects, just nothing. Then, just as suddenly as it stops, the noise comes back like nothing happened. I try to tell myself it's just my imagination, or maybe some natural phenomenon I don't understand yet. But deep down, I know better. Something isn't right here. Let me tell you how it all started. Or at least when I first realized this place wasn't just another patch of woods on a map. It was a humid morning in late June when I found the hunters. I was out on a routine patrol, walking one of the lesser-used trails about 5 miles from my tower. The air was thick with mist, and the ground squished under my boots from all the rain we'd been having. I remember thinking how quiet it was. Too quiet. No birds, no insects, not even the sound of wind through the trees. Just me and my own footsteps. I almost missed them at first. The bodies were lying in a small clearing off the trail, arranged in a perfect triangle. 3 men, all dressed in hunting gear, their rifles still slung over their shoulders. They looked like they'd just stopped and laid down, like they were taking a nap. But their eyes were open, staring blankly at the sky. I froze. My first thought was maybe they'd been attacked by an animal, but there wasn't a scratch on them. Then I noticed something strange. Thin white threads covering their bodies, almost like spider webs. But it wasn't spider webs. It was something else entirely. Something that looked alive. The threads clung to their skin and clothes, spreading out in delicate patterns like roots growing into the ground. I radioed it in right away, my hands shaking as I held the mic. "This is Ranger Jefferson," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I've got 3 deceased individuals on Trail 7 near marker 42. Requesting immediate backup." The dispatcher's voice crackled back through the static. "Copy that, Jefferson. Stay put and wait for local authorities." "Yeah," I muttered, staring at the bodies. "I'm not going anywhere." When the sheriff and his team arrived about an hour later, they didn't know what to make of it either. The coroner said it looked like they'd all died of heart attacks at the same time, which didn't make any sense because these guys were young and healthy looking, and those white threads. No one had an explanation for that. After they took the bodies away, I stayed behind to look around the clearing. That's when I noticed something else. Stone cairns, half buried in mud and moss, arranged in a wide circle around where the hunters had been lying. They looked ancient, weathered by time and covered in lichen. I'd never seen anything like them before. I told myself it was just a coincidence, just some old markers left by settlers or maybe even Native Americans long ago. But deep down, I felt it in my gut. This wasn't normal. Over the next few days, things only got stranger. Search dogs brought in to investigate refused to go near certain parts of the forest. They'd whimper and pull at their leashes like they were terrified of something we couldn't see. The locals started whispering about seeing strange things at dusk, shadows moving between the trees or figures that looked like people but weren't quite right. And then there were my own experiences. One morning, I woke up standing on top of a cliff miles away from my tower with no memory of how I got there. Another time, I found myself walking a trail I didn't recognize, even though I'd been through this forest dozens of times before. The worst part? Every time something like that happened, I felt this presence watching me. It wasn't like being watched by a person. It was bigger than that. Like the whole forest had eyes on me. I tried to brush it off as stress or exhaustion from long hours on patrol, but when Dr. Abigail Morton called me about her latest findings, I knew this wasn't just in my head. Dr. Abigail Morton was the only person I trusted to talk about what was going on. She was a botanist working on a research project in the area, studying fungi and other plant life unique to the Appalachian region. Like me, she was an outsider. One of the few women in her field, and definitely the only one brave enough to spend weeks alone in a place like this. We'd struck up a friendship over shared cups of coffee and quiet conversations about science and life. When she called me that evening, her voice sounded different, shaky, like she'd just seen something she couldn't explain. "Bobby," she said, skipping the usual pleasantries, "I need you to come to my cabin. Now." I didn't ask questions. I grabbed my flashlight and headed out, hiking the mile-long trail to her place as the sun dipped below the horizon. By the time I got there, the forest was cloaked in shadows, and the mist had thickened into a low fog that swirled around my boots. Abigail met me at the door, her face pale and her hands trembling as she held up a glass slide. "Look at this," she said, leading me inside. On her workbench were samples of that same white filament I'd seen on the hunters. Under her microscope, it looked even stranger, like tiny veins branching out in all directions. "It's not like any fungus I've ever seen," she explained. "It doesn't spread through spores like normal fungi. It's connected somehow. Every sample I've collected from different parts of the forest is identical, as if it's all part of one organism." "One organism," I repeated, trying to wrap my head around it. She nodded, her eyes darting toward the window as if she expected something to be watching us. "Bobby, this thing, it's alive in a way we don't understand. It's growing everywhere in this forest, and it's spreading faster than it should be able to." I leaned against the wall, my stomach twisting into knots. "What does that mean? Is it dangerous?" She hesitated before answering. "I don't know yet, but there's more." She reached for a stack of old journals on her desk, their covers cracked and faded with age. "I found these in the local archives. They're from settlers who lived here over a century ago, and some go back even further." She flipped one open to a page filled with shaky handwriting, asterisk. "The forest walks at night, asterisk." Another entry read, asterisk. "We hear voices in the mist, our loved ones calling us from beyond." My skin prickled as I read those words. "What happened to them?" I asked quietly. "They disappeared," Abigail said flatly. "Whole communities vanished without a trace. The only thing left behind were these cairns, those stone piles you mentioned near the hunters." I felt a chill run down my spine as I remembered those ancient stones, half buried in mud and moss, like they'd been forgotten for centuries. "Do you think they're connected?" I asked. "I do," she said, pulling out a map marked with red circles where cairns had been found across the forest. "These cairns form a pattern, a grid that stretches for miles. I think they were meant to contain whatever this thing is." "Contain it." My voice came out sharper than I intended. "You're saying someone knew about this fungus, or whatever it is, and tried to trap it." Abigail nodded grimly. "And now that erosion and time have damaged some of them, it's waking up." The room seemed to close in around me as her words sank in. This wasn't just some strange natural phenomenon. It was something ancient, something that had been buried for generations, but was now breaking free. Before I could respond, we both froze at the same time. Outside, just beyond the window, we heard it. A faint rustling sound that didn't belong to wind or animals. It was deliberate, almost rhythmic, like footsteps moving through the underbrush. Abigail grabbed my arm, her grip tight enough to hurt. "Bobby," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. "It knows we're here." We both stood frozen, listening. The sound outside grew louder, closer, like something heavy moving through the brush. It wasn't fast or frantic. It was slow, steady, purposeful. My hand instinctively went to the small hunting knife I kept on my belt, but I didn't draw it. What good was a knife against whatever this was? "Stay here," I whispered to Abigail, though my voice didn't sound as confident as I wanted it to. She grabbed my arm again, her eyes wide with fear. "Don't go out there," she hissed. "I'll just take a look," I said, trying to calm her. "Lock the door behind me." Reluctantly, she let go of my arm, and I stepped outside into the thick fog. The air felt colder than it had been just minutes ago, and the mist seemed heavier somehow, clinging to my skin like damp cloth. I shone my flashlight into the trees but saw nothing, just endless shadows and the faint outlines of branches swaying in the breeze. Then I heard it again, that rustling sound coming from somewhere to my left. Slowly I turned my flashlight in that direction and froze. At first, I thought it was a person standing there in the fog, but as the beam of light hit it, I realized it wasn't a person at all. It was wrong. Its shape was human-like. Arms, legs, a head, but its body was made entirely of forest debris. Twisted branches formed its limbs, clumps of moss and leaves covered its torso and its face. Its face was blank except for two hollow pits where eyes should have been. It didn't move at first. It just stood there watching me, or at least I thought it was watching me. Then slowly it tilted its head to one side like it was curious about me. My breath caught in my throat as I took a step back toward the cabin door. The thing mirrored my movement, stepping forward as I stepped back. Its body creaked like old wood bending under pressure. "Abigail." I called out softly over my shoulder, not daring to take my eyes off the thing. "Open the door." The door creaked open behind me just as the creature took another step forward. Without thinking twice, I darted back inside and slammed the door shut behind me, locking it tight. "What did you see?" Abigail asked urgently. I leaned against the door, trying to catch my breath. "I don't know," I admitted finally. "It looked like it was made of the forest itself." Abigail's face went pale as she sat down heavily at her desk. "It's connected," she muttered almost to herself. "The fungus. It's controlling everything out there." "What do you mean?" I asked. She grabbed one of her notebooks and flipped through it frantically before shoving it toward me. On one page was a diagram showing how fungal networks work, how they spread underground and connect plants and trees together like a massive web. "This fungus isn't just growing," she said. "It's thinking. It's using the forest like a body, a way to move and act." I stared at her in disbelief. "You're saying this whole forest is alive? Like, alive, alive?" "Yes," she said firmly, "and it's aware of us." The weight of her words hit me like a punch to the gut. All those strange things I'd seen, the silent animals, the time lapses, even that creature outside, it all made sense now in a way that terrified me more than anything else ever had. "This thing," Abigail continued hesitantly, "it doesn't think like we do. It doesn't understand individuality or life as we know it. To it, we're just resources." Resources. My stomach churned at the thought. She nodded grimly. "It absorbs everything that dies within its reach, memories, knowledge, even physical matter, and uses them to grow stronger." I felt sick as pieces of the puzzle started falling into place. The hunters covered in white filaments. The strange cairns meant to keep this thing contained. And now this creature outside that seemed to be part of something much bigger. Before either of us could say anything else, we heard another sound, this time coming from above us on the roof. A slow scraping noise like branches dragging across wood. Abigail looked up at me with wide eyes filled with panic. "Bobby, what do we do?" I didn't have an answer for her then, not yet. But deep down, I knew one thing for sure: this wasn't over. The scraping on the roof stopped suddenly, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence. Abigail and I stared at each other, barely breathing. Then came a new sound, slow, deliberate thuds, like something heavy walking across the roof. Whatever was up there, it wasn't in any hurry. It knew we weren't going anywhere. "We can't stay here," Abigail whispered, clutching her notebook to her chest like it was a lifeline. I nodded, my mind racing. "We'll head for the fire tower," I said quietly. "It's higher ground and we can lock ourselves in. Maybe we can figure out what to do from there." Abigail hesitated but then nodded. "Okay." I grabbed my flashlight and opened the cabin door just enough to peek outside. The fog was thicker now, swirling around the trees like smoke. The creature I'd seen earlier was gone, or at least I couldn't see it anymore. But that didn't make me feel any better. "Stay close to me," I told Abigail as we stepped outside. The forest felt different now, heavier, like the air itself was pressing down on us. Every step we took made the mist swirl around our legs, and every shadow looked like it could come alive at any moment. I kept my flashlight moving, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. We were about halfway to the fire tower when we heard it again. The rustling sound, this time coming from all around us. Abigail grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "They're everywhere," she whispered. I didn't answer because she was right. Shapes were starting to emerge from the fog, more of those creatures, their twisted bodies blending into the forest around them. They moved slowly but deliberately, closing in on us from all sides. "Run," I shouted, grabbing Abigail's hand and pulling her forward. We sprinted through the trees, the creatures closing in behind us. The fire tower came into view through the mist, a tall metal structure rising above the treetops like a beacon. My legs burned as we climbed the stairs 2 at a time, Abigail right behind me. When we reached the top, I slammed the door shut and locked it tight. We stood there for a moment, gasping for breath as the creatures gathered at the base of the tower. They didn't try to climb up after us. They just stood there, staring up with their hollow faces. "What do they want?" Abigail asked, her voice trembling. "They're not here by accident," I said grimly. "This thing, the fungus, it knows we're trying to stop it." Abigail pulled out her notebook and flipped to a page filled with sketches of cairns and notes about electromagnetic energy. "The cairns," she said urgently. "They're not just markers. They're part of a containment system. If we can restore them, restore them." I interrupted. "How? Half of them are buried or destroyed." She hesitated for a moment before answering. "There's one cairn that's still intact, near the center of the forest. If we can reactivate it, maybe it'll be enough to weaken this thing." I stared at her in disbelief. "You're saying we have to go back out there? Through all of that?" I gestured toward the creatures below us. "It's our only chance," she said firmly. I wanted to argue, to tell her it was impossible, but deep down I knew she was right. If we didn't do something, this thing would keep spreading until there was no stopping it. "All right," I said finally. "We'll go at first light." That night, neither of us slept much. The creatures stayed at the base of the tower, unmoving but ever present, like they were waiting for us to make our next move. The sun rose slowly the next morning, though it didn't feel like much of a sunrise. The mist was still thick, and the light barely filtered through the canopy above. Abigail and I packed quickly, just water, her notebook, and a few tools we thought might help. Neither of us said much. What was there to say? We both knew this was a long shot, but it was all we had. The creatures were gone when we stepped out of the fire tower. The forest was eerily quiet again, like it was holding its breath. I didn't know if that made me feel better or worse. "The cairn is about 2 miles from here," Abigail said, pointing to a spot on her map. "We'll have to cut through some unmarked trails." "Let's move," I said, gripping my flashlight. Even though the daylight was starting to break through, it felt like my only weapon, even if it wouldn't do much. We walked in silence for a while, the only sound coming from our boots crunching on the damp ground. Every so often, I'd catch movement out of the corner of my eye, a shadow slipping between the trees or a rustle in the underbrush. But when I turned to look, there was nothing there. "Do you feel that?" Abigail asked after a while. I nodded. The air felt heavier again, like we were walking into some kind of invisible wall. My skin prickled with unease, and my head started to ache, a dull, throbbing pain that seemed to get worse with every step. Then came the voices. At first, they were faint, just whispers carried on the wind. But as we got closer to the cairn's location, they grew louder and more distinct. They weren't just random sounds, they were words, and not just any words. They were voices. I recognized Bobby. I stopped dead in my tracks. That voice, it was my sergeant from Vietnam. He died in an ambush, along with most of my unit, but here he was, calling my name like he was standing just behind me. "Don't listen to it," Abigail said sharply, grabbing my arm. "It's not real," but it felt real, too real. "Bobby," another voice called out, this time softer, more familiar. My mother's voice. She'd passed away when I was a teenager, but hearing her now made my chest tighten with emotion. "Come home," she said gently. "You don't belong here." I shook my head and forced myself to keep walking, even as tears stung my eyes. Abigail stayed close beside me, her face pale but determined. The voices didn't stop. They only got louder as we approached the clearing where the cairn stood, and then we saw it. The cairn was massive, larger than any of the others I'd seen before. It stood in the center of a wide clearing, its stones weathered but still intact. The air around it shimmered faintly, like heat rising off pavement on a summer day. But we weren't alone. Standing between us and the cairn was me. At least it looked like me. Same face, same uniform, same everything, but its eyes were wrong. Empty and lifeless, like those creatures we'd seen before. "What is this?" I whispered. My voice barely audible. "It's using you," Abigail said quietly. "It's trying to stop us." The thing that looked like me tilted its head and smiled, a cold, hollow smile that sent chills down my spine. "You don't have to fight this," it said in my voice. "Just let go." I tightened my grip on the flashlight and took a step forward. "Get out of my way." The thing didn't move at first. It just stood there watching me with that eerie smile. Then it lunged. The thing that looked like me moved fast, faster than I expected. It closed the distance between us in seconds, its arms outstretched like it wanted to grab me. I barely had time to dodge, stumbling backward as it swiped at the air where I'd just been standing. "Bobby," Abigail shouted, but I couldn't look at her. My eyes were locked on the thing in front of me. It wasn't human. Not really. Up close, I could see how its skin wasn't skin at all. It was made of bark and moss, held together by those thin white filaments that seemed to pulse like veins. It moved like a puppet on strings, jerky and unnatural, but strong, too strong. I swung my flashlight at it out of instinct, the heavy metal casing connecting with its shoulder. The impact barely slowed it down. It turned its hollow eyes toward me and lunged again, forcing me to dive out of the way. "Abigail," I yelled, scrambling to my feet. "Get to the cairn." She hesitated for a moment, then nodded and took off toward the massive stone structure in the clearing. The thing, my double, saw her running and started to move after her. "Oh no, you don't," I muttered, grabbing a fallen branch from the ground and swinging it as hard as I could. This time, I hit it square in the back, and it stumbled forward before turning back to face me. It didn't speak again. It just charged at me with a terrifying speed. I braced myself for the impact, but before it could reach me, Abigail's voice rang out from behind. "Bobby." The cairn. I glanced over my shoulder and saw her standing next to the cairn, her hands pressed against its surface. The air around her shimmered even more now, like ripples spreading across water. The thing froze mid-step, its body twitching violently, as if something was pulling at it from all sides. It let out a sound, a low, guttural noise that didn't belong to anything human, and then collapsed to the ground in a heap of tangled branches and moss. I didn't wait to see if it would get back up. I ran to Abigail's side, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. "What did you do?" I asked. She looked up at me, her face pale but determined. "The cairn. It's still active. It's holding this thing back, but not for long. What do we do now? I asked, glancing nervously at the forest around us. The mist was swirling faster now, and the air felt electric, like a storm was about to break. Abigail hesitated for a moment before pulling out her notebook and flipping through its pages. "There's one last thing we can try," she said finally. The cairns were designed to focus energy, to contain this entity. But they need a connection, a living link. A link. I frowned. What does that mean? It means someone has to connect with it, she said quietly, to act as a bridge between us and whatever this thing is. I stared at her in disbelief. You're saying someone has to let this thing into their mind? She nodded slowly, just enough to communicate with it to make it understand boundaries. That's insane, I said, shaking my head. What if it takes over completely? What if... I'll do it, she said firmly. No, I said immediately. Absolutely not. Bobby. No, I snapped, cutting her off. You've done enough already. If anyone's doing this, it's me. She opened her mouth to argue but stopped when she saw the look on my face. Instead, she just nodded and stepped back. I took a deep breath and placed my hands on the cairn's surface. The stones were cold under my palms, but they seemed to hum faintly with energy, like they were alive somehow. At first, nothing happened. Then I felt it, a presence pressing against my mind like a wave crashing against a shore. It wasn't violent or angry. It was vast and overwhelming, like trying to comprehend the ocean all at once. Images flashed through my mind. Trees growing and dying in seconds, animals running through endless forests, people building cairns with desperate determination, entire lifetimes compressed into moments. And then came the voice, not words exactly, but feelings and impressions that formed thoughts in my head. Asterisk. Why do you resist? I gritted my teeth and forced myself to respond. Asterisk. You can't keep spreading like this. You're hurting people. Asterisk. We grow, the voice replied simply. Asterisk. Not here, I insisted. Asterisk. This is our home too. There was a long pause, a silence so deep it felt like time itself had stopped. Then came an answer. Asterisk. Boundaries. Asterisk. I opened my eyes and staggered back from the cairn, gasping for air as Abigail caught me before I fell. What happened? She asked anxiously. He had agreed. I said hoarsely. Boundaries, but only if we stay out of its territory. She nodded slowly, relief washing over her face. That's something. The forest around us seemed calmer now. The mist thinning slightly, the air less oppressive, but I knew things would never be the same again. The forest felt different. As we made our way back to the fire tower, the mist was still there, clinging to the trees like it always did, but it wasn't as thick, and the air didn't feel as heavy. The creatures, the ones made of branches and moss, were gone. It was like the forest had exhaled, retreating just enough to let us pass. Neither Abigail nor I said much during the walk back. My head was pounding, and my thoughts were jumbled, like pieces of a puzzle that didn't quite fit together anymore. I could still feel it, the presence of the forest, faint but lingering in the back of my mind. It wasn't invasive or hostile, but it was there, watching, waiting. When we reached the tower, Abigail turned to me, her face pale and exhausted. Bobby, she said softly, are you okay? I wanted to tell her I was fine, that everything would go back to normal now, but I couldn't lie to her, not after everything we'd been through. I don't know, I admitted. I can still feel it, like it's connected to me somehow. She nodded slowly, like she'd expected that answer. You're the bridge now, she said quietly. It needed someone to understand it, to communicate with it. Yeah, I muttered, rubbing my temples. But what does that even mean? I don't know, she said honestly. But you're still you, Bobby. You're still here. I wanted to believe her, but deep down I wasn't so sure. The following weeks were strange. The forest seemed calmer. No more strange noises at night. No more animals acting like statues or birds abandoning their nests. The mist still hung low over the ground, and the air still smelled damp and earthy, but it felt quieter somehow. I stayed on as a ranger, though things weren't exactly normal for me anymore. Sometimes I'd wake up in the middle of the night with visions of roots spreading deep into the earth, or trees growing and dying in an endless cycle. Other times, I'd hear whispers in my head, not words exactly, but impressions and feelings that weren't my own. At first it scared me, but over time I started to understand what they meant. The forest wasn't trying to hurt anyone. It was just alive in a way we couldn't comprehend. It didn't see us as enemies or even as individuals. To it, we were just part of the same system, like leaves on a tree or blades of grass in a field. Abigail left not long after that summer ended. She said she needed time to process everything that had happened, and I couldn't blame her for wanting to get away from this place. Before she left, she made me promise to keep an eye on things, to make sure the boundaries we'd set with the forest were respected. I kept that promise. The park officials chalked up my increasingly odd behavior to PTSD from Vietnam and stress from working alone in such an isolated area. They didn't question why certain trails were suddenly marked as restricted or why I insisted on rerouting visitors away from specific parts of the forest. They didn't need to know the truth. Every now and then I'd catch glimpses of something moving between the trees, shapes that weren't quite human but weren't entirely unnatural either. They never came close. They just watched from a distance before melting back into the shadows. And sometimes late at night when everything was quiet, I'd hear it again, that presence pressing gently against my mind like a tide lapping at the shore. It wasn't threatening anymore, not really, but it was always there, reminding me that this forest wasn't just trees and dirt and wildlife. It was something bigger than any of us could ever understand, and now I was part of it. My name is Eleanor McIntosh, but most folks just call me Ellie. I'm a park ranger up in the Boundary Waters canoe area, right along the border of Minnesota and Canada. It's February 1953, and this winter has been the coldest I've ever seen in my 35 years. The kind of cold that makes the air feel sharp in your lungs and freezes your breath before you can even see it. The lakes are frozen solid, thick enough to drive a truck across, and the forests are so quiet you'd think the whole world was holding its breath. I live alone in a log cabin out here, about as far from civilization as you can get. It's not much, but it's sturdy and stocked with enough supplies to last me through the winter. Most days, I don't mind the isolation. After serving as an army nurse in Korea, I came back home to find peace in these woods. My dad was a logger, my mom Ojibwe, so I grew up knowing this land like the back of my hand. It's where I feel most at home. But this winter, something feels different. The cold bites harder, the nights are darker, and there's a heaviness in the air I can't quite explain. The Ojibwe elders warned me about this season. They call it the hunger moon. They say it's when the barrier between our world and the spirit world thins and things that don't belong here can slip through. At first, I didn't think much of it. I've heard plenty of old stories growing up, tales about spirits that roam the woods or creatures that come out when people are desperate. But lately, I've been having these dreams. In them I'm running through endless forests, something huge and fast chasing me. When I wake up, my heart's pounding like I've just run a marathon. At first, I told myself it was just stress or maybe too much coffee before bed. But then, things started happening. Let me tell you how it all began. It started with the animals. Out here, you learn to read the land by watching them. Tracks in the snow, the way they move, where they gather, it all tells a story. But this winter, the story didn't make sense. For days I didn't see a single track. Not a rabbit, not a fox, nothing. Then all at once, I'd find herds of deer moving together, frantic like something was chasing them. But there was no sign of wolves or anything else that could cause that kind of panic. The first real shock came on one of my patrols. I was checking the trails near Lake Agnes when I saw it. A moose carcass up in the trees. Now, I've seen plenty of dead animals in my time, but this was different. The moose was wedged between two thick branches, at least 20 feet off the ground. Its body was frozen solid, but when I got closer, I saw that it had been drained of blood. Not a drop on the snow below. And here's the part that sent a chill down my spine. The flesh wasn't frozen. In temperatures like this, everything freezes solid in minutes. But not this. I radioed it in to headquarters, but all I got back was static and some strange wailing sounds that made my equipment buzz and crackle. It wasn't wind. I know what wind sounds like. This was something else entirely. A few days later, Walter Little Fox came by to check on me. Walter's an old Ojibwe guide who knows these woods better than anyone alive. He's been like a mentor to me ever since I started working out here. That day, though, he looked worried, more worried than I'd ever seen him. "Ellie," he said, his voice low and serious, "something's wrong in these woods." He told me about hunters who'd gone missing, men who knew this land as well as he did and wouldn't just get lost. He said their last known campsites were strange, trees bent into unnatural shapes like they'd been twisted by giant hands, snow that wouldn't melt even when brought near a fire, and footprints, huge ones, 4 toes instead of 5. Walter also mentioned something else. People in his community were leaving their winter camps early and moving inland. These were families who'd followed the same patterns for generations, but now they were breaking tradition because they felt something bad was coming. I wanted to brush it off as superstition or coincidence, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that Walter was right, especially after what happened next. A few nights later, I was sitting by the fire in my cabin when I heard it, a sound outside that made my blood run cold. It started as a low groan, almost like a tree bending under heavy snow, but then it turned into something else, something that sounded almost human but not quite right. It echoed through the trees and seemed to come from everywhere at once. I grabbed my rifle and stepped outside into the freezing night air. The moon was high and bright enough to light up the snow-covered ground. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, just the same silent forest as always. But then I noticed something: no tracks in the snow, except my own. And yet it felt like something had been watching me. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw flashes of those dreams again, running through endless woods while something huge and shadowy chased me just out of sight. The next morning, I decided to check on some of the old trappers' cabins scattered around my territory. Most of them hadn't been used in years, but something told me to take a look anyway. The first cabin I found had its door barricaded from the inside, with furniture piled high against it. Chairs tipped over and a table shoved against the frame like whoever had been inside was trying to keep something out. When I finally managed to push my way in, it was empty, except for a journal left on the floor near the fireplace. The entries were messy and hard to read, like they'd been written by someone in a hurry, or maybe shaking with fear, but one line stood out clear as day. "It walks like a man but stretches too tall." Asterisk, I felt a shiver crawl up my spine as I stood there in that cold cabin with nothing but silence around me. Something wasn't right out here. Something dangerous, and whatever it wasn't human. The days that followed were worse. The forest didn't feel like the forest anymore. It felt wrong. The silence wasn't peaceful like it used to be. It was heavy, like the trees were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. Even the air felt different, colder, sharper, like it was pressing down on me. I started finding tracks in the snow. At first, I thought they were human, big boot prints leading deep into the woods. But when I got closer, I realized they weren't boots at all. The prints were too long, too narrow, and there were only 4 toes. Whatever made them was big, bigger than any person I'd ever seen, and it walked with a strange, loping stride. One night, I decided to follow the tracks. They led me deeper into the forest than I'd ever gone before, winding through thick pines and over frozen streams. The deeper I went, the colder it got. My breath froze in front of me in thick clouds, and frost started forming on my eyelashes. It felt like the temperature had dropped 20 degrees in minutes. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a dead tree, tall and thin with bare branches sticking out at odd angles. But then it moved. Just a little. A shift so small I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. But then I saw the antlers. They weren't branches at all. They were massive, twisting antlers that seemed to grow and shrink as I stared at them. I froze, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The thing stood perfectly still, its body blending into the shadows of the trees. It was tall, taller than any man, with long arms that hung down past its knees and skin so tight you could see every bone underneath. Its head, God, its head looked like a deer's skull, but stretched and twisted into something unnatural. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, but something about it held me there, like it was daring me to make the first move. And then, it turned its head toward me. Its eyes weren't eyes at all, just empty sockets that seemed to pull all the light out of the air around them. And yet somehow, I knew it could see me. It tilted its head slightly, like it was studying me, deciding what to do next. That's when I heard my mother's voice. "Ellie," she said softly, "come closer." It wasn't possible. My mother had died years ago, but the voice was perfect, exactly how I remembered it. Warm and familiar and full of love. "Ellie," she said again, "it's okay. Come closer." For a second, just a second, I almost stepped forward, but then something in my gut told me to stop. That wasn't my mother's voice. It couldn't be. And whatever this thing was, it knew exactly what it was doing. I took a slow step back, keeping my eyes on it the whole time. It didn't move. Not yet. But I could feel its hunger like a weight pressing down on me. It wasn't just hungry for food. It was hungry for me, for everything I was. I don't know how long I stood there before I finally turned and ran as fast as I could back to my cabin. When I slammed the door shut behind me, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely lock it. That night, I didn't sleep at all. The next morning, Walter came by again, or at least he tried to. When he didn't show up at his usual time, I knew something was wrong. Walter was never late. I grabbed my rifle and headed toward his cabin, which was about 5 miles away through thick woods and frozen lakes. When I got there, the place looked untouched from the outside. No broken windows or signs of a struggle, but when I stepped inside, it was clear something had happened. The walls were covered in strange symbols drawn in blood, circles and lines that looked almost like maps or warnings. Walter's medicine bag lay open on the floor next to a pile of ashes that smelled faintly of burned sage. But Walter himself was gone. On his desk, he'd left an unfinished map, a rough sketch of the area with marks showing where strange things had been happening: abandoned cabins, missing hunters' campsites, and places where people had reported seeing something. All of them formed a rough circle around one spot, a place deep in the woods marked with a single word: binding asterisk. I didn't know what it meant yet, but I knew one thing for sure. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't going away on its own. And if Walter couldn't stop it, that meant it was up to me. The storm hit fast, faster than I expected. By the time I realized how bad it was going to get, it was already too late to turn back. The wind howled through the trees, carrying snow so thick it felt like a wall pressing against me. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. Every step forward felt like a fight, the cold biting through my layers and cutting into my skin. I'd been following Walter's map, trying to reach the spot he'd marked as binding. I didn't know exactly what I'd find there, but I had a feeling it was my only chance to stop whatever was happening. The Wendigo wasn't just hunting me anymore. It was spreading its hunger through the forest. Animals were fleeing, people were disappearing, and the air itself felt poisoned by its presence. But then, through the blizzard, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Headlights. A car. I stumbled toward it, my boots crunching through the snow. It was an old station wagon, half buried in a snowdrift with its engine dead and its windows frosted over. Inside I found a family, a man, a woman, and their teenage son, huddled together under blankets. Their faces were pale, their lips blue from the cold. "We got stuck," the man said when he saw me, his voice shaky. "We were trying to get back to town before the storm hit." They didn't know what they'd wandered into. They didn't know what was out here with them. I helped them out of the car and told them we needed to move fast. The cabin wasn't far, and it was our best shot at surviving the storm. But as we started walking, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The boy kept glancing over his shoulder like he could see something in the trees. The woman whispered under her breath, her words too soft for me to hear. And then there was the man. He wasn't walking right. His steps were uneven, his movements jerky, like he was struggling against something invisible. It didn't take long for the Wendigo to make its presence known. The first sign was the cold, a sharp drop in temperature that made the snow around us freeze into solid ice. Then came the sound, a low growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The boy screamed, pointing into the trees where shadows moved unnaturally fast. "Run!" I shouted. We took off through the storm, stumbling over roots and rocks hidden beneath the snow. The Wendigo didn't chase us outright. It didn't need to. It toyed with us instead, appearing just long enough to send us into a panic before vanishing again. Sometimes it looked like a deer standing on its hind legs. Other times it stretched impossibly tall, its antlers scraping against the tops of the trees. But worst of all was its voice. "Ellie!" It called out in my mother's voice again, soft and sweet like she used to sound when she woke me up for school as a kid. "Ellie, come here." I knew better than to listen, but one of the others didn't. The woman stopped dead in her tracks, staring into the darkness with wide eyes. "Mom," she whispered. Before I could stop her, she took a step toward the voice, and that's when it struck. The Wendigo moved so fast it was almost a blur, grabbing her with one long arm and dragging her into the trees before any of us could react. Her scream cut off abruptly, leaving only silence behind. We didn't have time to mourn. We had to keep moving. By some miracle, or maybe sheer stubbornness, we made it to an old ranger outpost just as my legs were about to give out from exhaustion. The boy and his father collapsed onto one of the bunks while I barricaded the door with whatever I could find: chairs, crates, even an old metal filing cabinet. But deep down I knew it wouldn't be enough. The Wendigo wasn't just outside, it was inside too. Not physically yet, but in our minds. The hunger it carried wasn't just its own. It spread like a sickness, making you crave things you shouldn't crave and think thoughts you shouldn't think. The father started muttering under his breath about food, how hungry he was and how there wasn't enough for all of us. His eyes darted toward his son in a way that made my stomach churn. And then there was me. My hands wouldn't stop shaking as I gripped my rifle tighter and tighter, fighting off thoughts that weren't mine. Thoughts about how easy it would be to survive if there weren't so many mouths to feed. This thing wasn't just hunting us, it was breaking us down from the inside out. I knew we couldn't stay there for long. I knew we couldn't stay in the outpost. The Wendigo wasn't going to stop, and the longer we stayed, the more it would twist us. I could already see it working on the father. His eyes were hollow, his breathing shallow, and he wouldn't stop staring at his son. I had to get us out of there before it was too late. Walter's map came back to me. The spot marked asterisk binding asterisk. I didn't know what I'd find there, but it was our only chance. If this thing had been stopped before, maybe I could do it again. I grabbed my pack and told the father and son we were leaving. The father didn't argue. He just nodded slowly, like he was barely holding on to himself. The storm hadn't let up, but we pushed through it anyway. The cold was worse now, cutting through every layer of clothing like it wanted to freeze us from the inside out. The boy stumbled a few times, but I kept pulling him up, telling him to keep moving. I didn't tell them what I suspected, that the Wendigo was letting us go because it wanted us to reach the binding site. It wanted us there. By the time we reached the spot on Walter's map, the storm had died down just enough for me to see where we were. It was a frozen waterfall, its icy surface glowing faintly in the moonlight. Behind it, there was a dark opening, a cave hidden by layers of ice and snow. "This is it," I said, though my voice sounded small in the vast silence around us. The boy clung to my arm as we stepped inside. The air in the cave was colder than outside, if that was even possible, and every breath felt like shards of glass in my chest. The walls were covered in markings, symbols like the ones I'd seen in Walter's cabin, carved deep into the stone. At the center of the cave was a circle of rocks arranged around a blackened patch of ground that smelled faintly of burned wood and something metallic. I knew this place wasn't natural. It felt ancient, heavy with something I couldn't explain. This was where they'd bound it before, where they'd trapped it long enough for people to forget what it really was. But now it was awake again. The father collapsed near the circle, clutching his head and groaning in pain. The boy knelt beside him, crying softly as he tried to shake him awake. I didn't have much time. I reached into my pack and pulled out my mother's medicine pouch, the one she'd given me years ago before she passed. Inside were small bundles of herbs, a few stones, and a tiny vial of red ochre powder she used for ceremonies. I didn't know exactly what to do. I wasn't trained in these rituals, but something deep inside me told me this was what I needed. As I knelt by the circle, a sound echoed through the cave, a low growl that made my heart stop. The Wendigo stepped into view at the mouth of the cave, its massive antlers scraping against the icy walls as it ducked inside. Its empty eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment everything else disappeared. It felt like time had stopped, like there was nothing left in the world but me and this thing. It moved slowly toward us, its long limbs bending unnaturally as it crept closer. The boy screamed as he clung to his father, who was now completely still, his body limp like he'd given up entirely. I forced myself to focus on the circle in front of me. My hands shook as I poured the red ochre onto the blackened ground and whispered words I half remembered from my mother's stories, words about balance and protection and binding spirits that didn't belong here. The Wendigo stopped just outside the circle, tilting its head as if curious about what I was doing. Its hunger pressed against me like a physical force, making it harder to breathe with every passing second. Then it spoke, not with words but with thoughts that slammed into my mind like thunder. Asterisk, you cannot stop me. I ignored it and kept going, sprinkling herbs into the circle and cutting my palm with my knife to let a few drops of blood fall onto the stones. My mother had always said blood carried power, enough power to seal things that couldn't be sealed any other way. The Wendigo roared then, a sound so loud and raw that it shook the walls of the cave. It lunged forward but stopped just short of crossing into the circle. Its antlers scraped against an invisible barrier as it snarled and clawed at empty air. I kept chanting, or maybe praying. I wasn't sure anymore. All I knew was that I had to finish what Walter started all those years ago. Finally, with one last word, everything went still. The Wendigo froze mid-snarl, its body stiffening as if held by invisible chains. Its empty eyes locked onto mine one last time before its form began to dissolve into shadows that swirled around the cave like smoke caught in a windstorm. And then, silence. When I opened my eyes again, I was lying on the ground outside the cave with snow falling softly around me. The boy sat beside me, his face pale but alive. His father wasn't there anymore. He's gone, the boy whispered when he saw me looking for him. I nodded slowly and pulled him close as tears stung my eyes, not from sadness but from exhaustion and relief that we were still alive at all. We made our way back through the forest in silence, leaving behind whatever remained of that ancient evil trapped once more beneath layers of ice and stone. But even now, even as I sit here writing this, I can still feel it watching me from somewhere far away. And deep down, I know this isn't over. Spring came late that year. The snow melted slowly, like the forest was reluctant to let go of the winter. I stayed out in the Boundary Waters longer than I should have, long after most rangers had returned to town. I told myself it was because I needed to finish my reports, clean up the cabin, and make sure everything was in order for the next season. But the truth was, I didn't want to leave. Not yet. The boy had been taken back to town by a search party I'd called on the radio a few days after we returned. He didn't say much to them, and neither did I. What could we say? That something ancient and hungry had stalked us through the woods, that his father hadn't just disappeared but had been consumed by something no one would ever believe existed. No one would understand. So, we didn't tell them. I stayed behind, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. The cave still haunted my thoughts, the symbols on the walls, the circle of stones, and the way the Wendigo had looked at me before it vanished. It wasn't just gone. I could feel it. A part of it was still with me, buried deep in my mind like a splinter I couldn't pull out. At night I dreamed of it, not the way it looked, but the way it saw. In my dreams, I wasn't myself anymore. I was something else, something cold and empty, moving through the forest with endless hunger. The trees bent away from me as I passed, their branches snapping under the weight of my presence. Animals fled before they even saw me, sensing what I was before they could understand it. And then there were the voices. They weren't loud or clear like they'd been in the cave. They were whispers now, soft and distant, but always there, just at the edge of my hearing. Sometimes they sounded like Walter or my mother, or even the boy's father. Other times, they were voices I didn't recognize at all. I tried to ignore them, but they never really went away. One day, while cleaning out Walter's cabin, I found something that stopped me in my tracks. It was an old journal, his handwriting scrawled across pages filled with notes about spirits, rituals, and stories passed down through his family. One entry caught my eye. The Wendigo cannot be destroyed, only bound, but those who bind it are never free of its shadow. I read that line over and over until the words blurred together on the page. It made sense now. The dreams, the whispers, the feeling that something was always watching me from just beyond the trees. I wasn't free of it. The Wendigo might have been trapped again, buried beneath ice and stone where it couldn't hurt anyone, but a piece of it had stayed with me. Maybe that was its way of surviving, leaving a mark on those who faced it so it could find its way back when the time was right. I thought about leaving, about going back to town and trying to live a normal life again, but deep down I knew I couldn't. Not now. Not ever. The last thing I did before leaving Walter's cabin was write down everything that had happened. The tracks in the snow, the moose in the trees, Walter's warnings, and what we'd faced in that cave. Every detail went into a journal of my own, so that if anyone ever found themselves in this position again, they'd know what they were dealing with. When I finished writing, I packed up my things and headed deeper into the wilderness, farther north than I'd ever gone before. There were no trails where I was going, no cabins or outposts or signs of civilization, just endless forest and frozen lakes stretching all the way to Canada. I don't know how long I'll stay out here, maybe until spring comes again, or maybe forever. All I know is that as long as there's even a chance that thing could come back, someone has to be here to stop it. And if it does come back, this time I'll be ready.